The encounter in the park. Introduction of characters. It was a bright, crisp Saturday morning in the local park. The sun bathed the trees with golden light, casting long shadows across the lush green lawns where families gathered for picnics and leisurely walks. The scent of fresh-cut grass filled the air, blending with the faint, earthy aroma of the nearby woods. Children's laughter echoed in the distance as groups of parents chatted on park benches, enjoying the respite of the weekend. The atmosphere was peaceful, serene, until the moment Nia stepped into the scene. Nia Lawson, a black woman in her mid-30s, was no stranger to the park. In fact, she had frequented it many times over the years, often with the same company. Walking alongside her were two young white children, Emma and Jacob. Emma, a 7-year-old girl with curly blonde hair and wide blue eyes, skipped ahead, her giggles punctuating the calm morning. Jacob, a 6-year-old boy with tousled brown hair and an inquisitive expression, lagged behind, picking up sticks and pebbles as he went. Both children were in the care of Nia, a private childcare provider who had been with the family for several years. Emma and Jacob had grown close to her, seeing her as a protector, a mentor, and above all, a friend. Nia had built a life for herself caring for children from all walks of life. Though her own background had been humble, she had worked tirelessly to establish herself in her field. She had no children of her own, but she poured her heart into the kids she cared for, becoming a steady presence in their lives. She often took Emma and Jacob on outings to the park, where they could play freely and be children, far away from the demands of school or home. This morning, like most others, was spent in simple enjoyment. Nia kept a watchful eye on the children, smiling at their antics. Emma climbed a jungle gym with ease, her tiny hands gripping the bars as she made her way to the top, while Jacob, ever the explorer, examined a patch of dandelions near the park's edge. Nia stood nearby, making sure both were safe, a quiet contentment in her heart. But as they neared the swing set, the peacefulness of the moment began to shift. A group of men, dressed in dark blue police uniforms, stood just beyond the swings, their hands on their hips as they surveyed the area. At first, they barely glanced at Nia and the children. But as Nia and her charges walked closer, the officers' eyes narrowed. The air around them seemed to thicken, as if the very atmosphere was changing in response to the tension building on the outskirts of the playground. Nia didn't think much of it at first. She had seen police officers in the park before, occasionally stopping to check on things or to chat with families. But this time was different. As they drew nearer to the officers, the men exchanged glances, a slight frown forming on the face of the tallest one. Her frustration began to rise, but she tried to keep her emotions in check. She knew where this was heading, and she wasn't about to let these officers make her the target of their misplaced suspicions. "Everything is fine," she replied firmly. "I've been taking care of these children for years. If you'd like, I can provide you with contact information for their parents." But the officers didn't seem interested in hearing her explanations. Instead, they began to circle, their gaze darting between Nia and the children, as if looking for something, anything, that might suggest wrongdoing. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man who had remained silent up to this point, stepped forward. "Let's see some identification," he said, his tone commanding. Nia's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the sweat gathering on the back of her neck, her hands clammy. She reached into her bag for her ID, but as she did so, the officers closed in around her, their movements becoming more tense and deliberate. The situation was escalating quickly, and she could feel the walls closing in. The children, visibly shaken now, looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. Emma clung to her leg, and Jacob reached for her hand, his small fingers trembling. As Nia handed the officer her ID, the unmistakable feeling of being scrutinized, judged, dehumanized, settled heavily in her chest. The officers didn't trust her, didn't believe her, simply because of the color of her skin. It was a familiar feeling, one she had encountered all too many times before. But today, something inside her snapped. Today, she wouldn't back down. Today, she would fight. Confrontation. Escalation of hostilities. Nia could feel the hairs on the back of her neck prickle as the tension in the air grew thick with hostility. The officers were no longer simply asking questions, they were challenging her, confronting her with an intensity that seemed to come from a place of pure suspicion. Each of their steps felt like a calculated move, closing in on her like wolves circling prey. She had tried to explain herself. She had offered her identification. But the officers were not interested in the truth. They were looking for something else. One officer, Officer Thompson, took a step forward, his broad chest puffing up slightly as he took up a more aggressive stance. He didn't say a word at first, but his eyes bore down on Nia like he was trying to unravel her, trying to find some crack in her calm exterior. He crossed his arms, a sign of both authority and threat, and leaned in just a bit too close for comfort. "I don't think you're being entirely honest with us," Officer Thompson said, his voice low but tinged with suspicion. His eyes flickered back to the children, Emma and Jacob, who were now clinging to Nia's sides. "Is that so?" Nia asked, her voice unwavering, despite the rising anger in her chest. Who was scanning Nia and the children with an unsettling intensity. His expression hardened, and he began to move toward them. Initial tension. "Hey," the officer called out, his voice commanding and authoritative, yet laced with an underlying edge. Nia, startled by the abruptness of his tone, slowed her pace and turned to face him, instinctively placing herself between the officers and the children. "Yes," she responded, her voice calm but laced with curiosity. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she could feel the tension hanging in the air, like a thick fog. The officer didn't answer immediately, instead continuing to look at Nia with a questioning expression, his eyes flickering to Emma and Jacob, then back to her. "You with them?" The officer's words were blunt, almost accusatory. Nia blinked, surprised by the question. She glanced down at Emma and Jacob, who were now looking back at the officer with wide eyes. Emma clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her fingers trembling slightly. Jacob, ever the brave one, took a step closer to Nia, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Yes, I'm with them," Nia answered, her voice steady. She could feel the knot in her stomach tighten, but she refused to show it. She wasn't one to be intimidated easily. The officer didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he stepped forward, his tone becoming more demanding. "You're their caregiver, right?" he asked, eyeing Nia suspiciously, as though searching for some sign that would confirm his unfounded doubts. Nia nodded, her gaze meeting his with calm resolve. "Yes, I've been taking care of them for several years now. I'm their nanny." The officer didn't respond immediately, but his gaze lingered on her a moment longer. Then, without warning, another officer, younger and shorter than the first, joined the conversation. "You don't look like their nanny," the younger officer muttered, his words barely above a whisper, but still cutting through the tension in the air. It was a subtle jab, but one that hit its mark with a venomous sting. Nia felt a flicker of annoyance rise within her. Her hands, which had been loosely holding the straps of her bag, tightened as she forced herself to remain composed. She glanced at Emma, who was now shifting nervously from foot to foot, and Jacob, who was clutching her hand for reassurance. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Nia asked, her voice growing sharper now. The younger officer didn't answer, but the first officer stepped forward again, his posture stiffening as he crossed his arms. "There's been some reports," the officer began, his eyes flickering over to Emma and Jacob. "We've been seeing a lot of unusual situations around here lately. Are you sure everything's on the up and up?" A cold chill ran down Nia's spine. She felt the weight of the officer's words pressing down on her, like an invisible hand squeezing her chest. Thompson stepped even closer, narrowing his eyes. "How do we know you're not a kidnapper? Taking these kids out of their homes without any proper paperwork?" His voice held a dangerous edge, his tone accusatory, as if he already had decided Nia was guilty of something. Nia's blood ran cold for a second, the implication of his words sinking in like a heavy weight. A kidnapper? She wanted to scoff at the absurdity of it. But the moment was too serious to laugh it off. She forced herself to breathe deeply, trying to calm the storm of emotion that surged within her. I am their caretaker, she said, her voice tight but firm. I've been looking after them for years. I've been through background checks, paperwork, everything you'd expect from a responsible adult who takes care of children. She held out the ID once again, more resolute than before, but Officer Thompson only waved it off dismissively, as though it were irrelevant to him. His gaze moved to Emma and Jacob again, who had begun to grow more visibly upset as the situation escalated. They don't seem to know you, Officer Thompson pressed, his voice becoming sharper. How do you explain that? His eyes flicked toward the children, who were trembling under the increasing intensity of the situation. I've been their nanny, their caregiver, for years now, Nia repeated, her tone growing more insistent. They know me, and I know them. I assure you, there's no reason for this to go any further. The officer stared at her, his gaze unreadable, before turning his attention to the other officers standing behind him, as though seeking validation for his assumptions. The tension was palpable. Nia could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she refused to let herself crack under the pressure. She kept her focus on Emma and Jacob, doing her best to shield them from the growing storm of hostility. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. Finally, one of the officers, a younger man, barely in his 20s, spoke up, his voice shaky but eager to prove his authority. Let's just take them down to the station, figure this all out, he suggested, his eyes darting nervously toward Nia and the children. We'll get this cleared up, no problem. That was the breaking point. Nia had had enough. No, she snapped, stepping forward so that she stood directly between the officers and the children, her hands raised in a gesture of defiance. You will not take them anywhere. This is not how you treat people, especially not children. I have every right to be here with them. What you're doing is not only wrong, it's dangerous. The officers paused, the young officer's words hanging in the air. But Nia wasn't done. She felt the fury rising up from the pit of her stomach, and it threatened to boil over. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was disgusted. This wasn't about paperwork or rules. It was about race. She had experienced this kind of treatment too many times before, had seen the way people like her were treated as suspects simply for existing in a space they were told they didn't belong in. I know what this is about, Nia continued, her voice steady but full of emotion. You see me, and you see a black woman with white children, and it makes you uncomfortable. You think there's something wrong with that. But let me tell you something, I'm not here to explain myself to you. I'm here to protect these children. And you are crossing a line. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Officer Thompson, who had remained silent for a moment, now took a step back, as if trying to reassess the situation. But Nia wasn't giving him that chance. She locked eyes with him, unflinching. You are doing nothing but harassing me right now, she said, her voice like ice. You don't even know me, and yet you're making assumptions about my character, about my intentions. This isn't about safety. This is about race. And you know it. Nia's growing resilience. Nia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The fear she had felt earlier, when the officers first approached, when she wasn't sure what was going to happen, was now replaced with something stronger, a quiet, resolute strength. She glanced down at Emma and Jacob, who were still standing by her side, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Emma's face was streaked with tears, while Jacob had his thumb in his mouth, trying to comfort himself. Emma, Jacob, Nia said softly, bending down to their level. I need you to stay close, okay? It's going to be okay. We're not going anywhere. Just stay close to me. She gave them a small, reassuring smile, though inside, her heart ached for them. They were so innocent, so caught up in something they couldn't understand. Emma, the ever-brave one, wiped away her tears and nodded silently, while Jacob squeezed her hand tighter, as if holding on for dear life. Nia stood up straight again, turning her gaze back to the officers. Her voice was steady, controlled, but it held an undeniable edge. I have every right to be here, she repeated. And you have no right to question my presence in this park or my relationship with these children. But Officer Thompson wasn't backing down. His jaw tightened, and his hand hovered near his belt, his fingers brushing the edge of his baton. I said, "Let's go down to the station," he barked, his voice rising with authority. "This can all be sorted out there." Nia's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how far they were willing to go to escalate this. The thought of being physically restrained, of her and the children being dragged away to some unknown destination, was terrifying. But she stood her ground. She wasn't going to let them drag her away. She wasn't going to let them put her down just because they didn't like the way she looked or the people she cared for. "You can't just take us," Nia said, her voice shaking with the intensity of her emotions. "That's not how this works. You can't do this." Racial profiling. It was then that Nia understood with startling clarity just what was happening. The officers didn't see her as a caretaker, a mentor, or a trusted adult. They saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the same spaces as the white children she cared for. It wasn't about the children, and it wasn't about her actions, it was about the color of her skin, and the unfounded fears it triggered in these officers. The young officer, still visibly nervous, spoke up again. "We're just doing our job," he said, though the shaky note in his voice betrayed his discomfort. "It's protocol." "Protocol," Nia echoed bitterly. "And what protocol is that? The one that targets black people in predominantly white neighborhoods? The one that assumes we're all criminals just because we don't look like we belong?" The officers fell silent for a moment, but their eyes didn't soften. Officer Thompson's jaw clenched even harder, his stance becoming even more rigid. "I suggest you keep your voice down, ma'am," he said, his tone cold, warning her that he wouldn't hesitate to take more forceful action. But Nia wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not now, not ever. The children's reaction. Emma's voice broke through the rising tension, her small body trembling against Nia's leg. "Why are they being so mean to you, Nia?" she asked, her voice high-pitched and frightened. Jacob, unable to hold back his tears any longer, began to sob quietly, his small frame shaking. "I want to go home," he whimpered, clutching at Nia's hand as though it were a lifeline. Nia's heart broke at the sight of their fear, their confusion. These children, who trusted her, were now caught in a storm they couldn't understand. They were scared, and there was nothing she could say to make it better. "Emma, Jacob," Nia said softly, her voice steady despite the churning emotions inside her, "I'm going to make sure we're okay. I'm going to make sure you're safe." But inside, she knew this wasn't just about her and the children anymore. It was about a system that had failed her time and time again, and it was about to learn that she wasn't going to let it win. The unexpected twist: who was Nia? A new identity unveiled. Just as the tension seemed to reach a boiling point, with Nia standing her ground against the officers, the situation took an unexpected turn. The officers were on the verge of placing Nia under arrest, their movements quickening and their words harsher. Officer Thompson's hand hovered near his baton, his gaze sharp and unyielding as if he believed he had the upper hand. The air was thick with hostility, and the situation felt as though it would inevitably escalate into something far worse. Emma and Jacob were clinging to Nia, both visibly frightened, and her heart ached for them. She had hoped this would be resolved peacefully, but now it seemed impossible. That's when it happened. A voice cut through the tension like a calm breeze sweeping through a storm. It was smooth, authoritative, and unmistakably confident. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" The officers turned, their gazes quickly falling on a woman who had approached the scene. She was impeccably dressed, her attire speaking of wealth and status, tailored, elegant, and professional. She carried herself with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Her eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the group, landing briefly on Nia before shifting to the officers. The sudden appearance of this woman seemed to put the officers on edge, though none of them dared to make a move without her permission. Nia was momentarily taken aback by the woman's presence. She had not seen her before, but something about her, the way she commanded attention, struck a chord with Nia. She glanced toward the officers, but their posture immediately shifted. There was a subtle shift in their demeanor, as though they recognized something, or someone, in the woman's confident approach. "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said, his tone slightly more cautious, though still maintaining a semblance of authority. "We were just addressing a situation involving this woman and the children." "Addressing?" the woman interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "From what I can see, you're harassing her." The officers paused, exchanging uncertain glances. The woman's presence seemed to change the dynamic entirely. They had been so focused on their misguided assumptions about Nia that they hadn't even noticed the power shift that had just occurred with the arrival of this woman. Nia looked up at the woman, trying to gauge who she was. The woman didn't seem to wait for permission before continuing, her voice now direct and piercing. "This is Nia Lawson," she said, her words cutting through the air. "And I suggest you step back immediately." Nia felt her heart race. She had no idea who this woman was or why she would step in to defend her. But as the woman spoke, the officers seemed to lose their confidence. Their posture slackened, and they took a step back, suddenly unsure of how to proceed. Though she couldn't suppress the anger that still simmered beneath her calm exterior. "But thank you for stepping in." The woman gave her a nod, her expression now gentle, though her eyes still held a spark of indignation. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." "You've got my word on that." Nia was still trying to process the whirlwind of events when the woman continued, her voice taking on a more formal tone. "You should know," the woman said, looking back at the officers one last time, "that Nia Lawson is not just the daughter of a wealthy businessman. She's built a name for herself, earned every bit of respect she has. As an art curator, she's brought world-class exhibitions to our city. She's been instrumental in opening up art to underrepresented communities, including programs for youth and people of color." Nia's cheeks flushed slightly at the mention of her career, but the woman wasn't finished. "And beyond that, Nia is a tireless advocate for social change. She's used her platform to raise awareness for issues like racial injustice, police reform, and equitable education for all. The kind of work that makes real, lasting change. So, you see, Officer Thompson, this isn't just about who you think she is." The officers remained silent, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. They had expected to encounter an ordinary black woman they could intimidate, someone without the means or the will to fight back. But they hadn't counted on this. Nia wasn't just anyone. She was a force to be reckoned with. The policeman's shock. The silence stretched as the officers exchanged looks. Officer Thompson, still standing in front of Nia, seemed to shrink under the weight of what he had just learned. His arrogance, his assumption that he could dominate this situation, evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. "I had no idea," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, his gaze darting away from Nia's now piercing stare. For the first time in the conversation, the officers seemed unsure of themselves. The power they thought they had, power that was built on racial bias and assumptions, had just crumbled. Nia could see the uncertainty on their faces, particularly Officer Thompson's. He seemed unable to grasp the magnitude of the mistake he had made. The other officers remained still, their discomfort palpable as they realized how deeply they had misjudged the situation. "I think we're done here," the woman said, her tone final. "You'll leave Nia and the children alone, won't you?" Officer Thompson swallowed hard, his expression conflicted. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am. We'll leave." As the officers slowly backed away, Nia stood tall, the fire in her chest dimming but not extinguishing. She hadn't just won this battle, she had made sure they knew that they would never treat her, or anyone else, this way again. "Nia Lawson?" Officer Thompson repeated, his voice filled with confusion and disbelief. Is that supposed to mean something?" Nia didn't get the chance to answer before the woman continued, her tone now layered with calm authority and frustration. "Yes, officer, it does. Nia Lawson is not just some random caregiver you decided to harass. She is one of the most respected philanthropists in this city and an internationally renowned art curator. She's the daughter of Marcus Lawson, the billionaire investor and entrepreneur, and she has a significant influence in both the art world and social justice circles. So unless you have a warrant, I suggest you step aside and leave her alone." The shock on the officers' faces was palpable. The air around them seemed to freeze as the revelation hit them with full force. Officer Thompson blinked, his mouth working as though trying to process the words that had just been spoken. He looked at Nia with something akin to disbelief, his eyes widening as he pieced together the information. The woman, who Nia now recognized as a local community leader, someone who had spoken at various public events, stepped forward, her presence even more commanding than before. "I would also like to remind you that Nia is a vocal advocate for racial justice. She's been fighting for the rights of marginalized communities for years. So if you're going to arrest her, you'd better have more than just your baseless assumptions and racial prejudice to back it up." Nia felt a weight lift from her chest as the words were spoken, but she didn't allow herself to relax just yet. She knew that in a system that had been so quick to target her, her identity, no matter how influential, might not be enough to change the course of events. But the sudden shift in the officer's demeanor gave her a sliver of hope. Officer Thompson was the first to speak, but his voice now wavered, tinged with uncertainty. I didn't realize. I mean, we didn't know," he trailed off, his eyes flickering between the woman and Nia, his mind clearly struggling to process the sudden shift in the power dynamics. "I apologize, ma'am," he said, his voice stiff and reluctant. The other officers stood still, either unwilling to speak or unsure of how to continue. Their authority, so firm just moments ago, seemed to crumble in the face of this new information. Nia felt the weight of their gaze, but it no longer felt as heavy as it had before. She held her ground, no longer intimidated by their presence. The situation wasn't over, not yet, but it was undeniably different now. Background revealed. The woman, now turning to Nia, gave her a respectful nod. "Nia, I had no idea you were in the park today," she said, her voice softening. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Nia shook her head slightly, a rueful smile crossing her lips. "It's nothing new," she replied quietly. The fallout: accountability. Nia's response to the officers. The moment the officers began to retreat, Nia felt a brief flicker of victory. The oppressive weight that had hung over her since the confrontation began seemed to lift, but it wasn't enough. She wasn't going to let them walk away without facing the consequences of their actions. As the officers began to turn, preparing to leave the scene, Nia's composure held firm. Her body remained upright, her posture demanding. She wasn't simply going to let this incident slide. "Nia?" The well-dressed woman, who had intervened earlier, called softly, but Nia held up a hand. She wasn't done yet. "Not so fast," Nia said, her voice sharp but controlled. "Before you go, I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." The officers paused, and for a split second they exchanged looks. Officer Thompson, particularly, seemed uncomfortable. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize or brush it off, but Nia raised a hand to stop him. "No," she said firmly. "You don't get to just walk away from this. You don't get to pretend like this was an innocent misunderstanding. What you did today was wrong. You know it. I know it. And now the world is going to know it." Her words were piercing, and she could see them take effect. The officers shifted uncomfortably on their feet, realizing that they had not just failed in their duties but had participated in something far worse. This wasn't about procedural errors or misunderstandings, it was about racial bias, discrimination, and abuse of power. "You need to understand," Nia continued, her eyes now cold and unwavering, "that this kind of behavior, this treatment of Black people, happens every day. Not just here, not just to me, but to countless others who don't have the means or the platform to fight back. I won't let you get away with it. And neither should anyone else." The well-dressed woman, who had been watching the exchange intently, quickly stepped to the side, pulling out her phone. She began recording the entire scene, ensuring that Nia's powerful words would not be lost. The woman's calm, methodical approach to capturing the confrontation added weight to the moment, as if she understood that this wasn't just about one woman standing up to the police. This was about accountability, about ensuring that there would be no erasure of this experience. "I'm recording this," the woman announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This footage is going to the media. People need to see this. People need to know what's really happening." Nia looked at her, nodding with a quiet appreciation. The woman's support, her willingness to amplify Nia's voice, gave Nia a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just going to fight this alone. Officer Thompson's defense. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably as Nia's words hung in the air. His face flushed with embarrassment, but his pride kept him from backing down. He cleared his throat before speaking, trying to regain control of the situation. Look, I'm just doing my job," he muttered. "We had a report of suspicious activity. I didn't know who she was, and I was just making sure everything was okay. I didn't mean any harm." His justification was weak, a flimsy excuse that fell flat in the face of Nia's unwavering resolve. He tried to sound authoritative, but his words didn't carry the same weight as they had earlier. The uncertainty in his voice was palpable. He could see the way people were starting to look at him, sideways, suspiciously, as if they knew his defense didn't hold up. "You didn't know who I was?" Nia repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to make this okay? Do you really think that gives you the right to harass me in front of children? To question my right to be here, just because I don't fit your narrow idea of who belongs in this park?" The officers were silent. Officer Thompson shifted on his feet, glancing down at the ground as though ashamed, but he couldn't meet Nia's eyes. He tried again, to salvage what was left of his dignity. "I was just being cautious. I didn't mean to upset anyone." "We get a lot of reports like this," he said, trailing off as his own words seemed to lose all meaning. The onlookers, who had begun to gather around when the confrontation began, now watched with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. Many had already begun to film, their phones held high as they captured every moment. The crowd, growing larger by the second, added weight to Nia's words. She wasn't just a lone voice anymore, she was a beacon of accountability, standing in the face of systemic oppression. The well-dressed woman turned to the officers, her expression now one of stern disapproval. "Don't bother," she said sharply. "Your excuses aren't going to work here. You've just been caught in your own prejudice. The public is watching. The world is watching." Nia's frustration was now an undeniable force. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to keep calm. She could feel the energy in the air shift. The officers were no longer in control of the narrative. Nia was. Media coverage. Within minutes, the footage from the well-dressed woman's phone began to circulate. What started as a few whispered exchanges between bystanders turned into something much larger. Social media exploded with the hashtag #JusticeForNia, and local news stations began running stories about the incident. The video quickly went viral, spreading far beyond the park and capturing the attention of news outlets across the city. The hashtag was trending, and people from all over the country weighed in with outrage, solidarity, and calls for justice. Public figures and community leaders issued statements condemning the officers' actions. The city's mayor, who had long been a supporter of police reform, released a public apology for the officers' behavior and promised a full investigation. Several activists and civil rights organizations called for accountability, demanding that the officers involved be held responsible for their actions. Nia's calmness in the face of racial profiling and aggression earned her praise from countless individuals across social media. Many commended her for handling the situation with grace and dignity, while others praised the way she used her voice to address the deeper issues at play: racial profiling, police brutality, and the systemic abuse of power that many Black individuals and families faced every day. The viral attention wasn't just about Nia's personal experience, but about the larger conversation it sparked. People everywhere began to discuss the systemic inequalities embedded in the criminal justice system, particularly the way Black people were often treated with suspicion and hostility, even when they were simply living their lives. The broader impact. As the media coverage of the incident grew, organizations that Nia had long supported reached out to her, asking her to speak out about the need for police reform and greater accountability. She was invited to interviews, public forums, and panels, where her experience and her voice became a critical part of the ongoing conversation about racial justice. Nia's newfound platform allowed her to push for real change. She spoke with power and clarity, addressing not just the incident in the park, but the broader issues of systemic racism and police violence. She joined forces with organizations working for racial justice and criminal justice reform, using her voice to amplify their message and demand change. Her story became a rallying cry for those who had long been fighting against the very issues she had experienced firsthand. Nia's bravery in the face of injustice, her refusal to be silenced, and her commitment to accountability inspired countless others to speak out, to demand better treatment, and to challenge the systems that upheld racial inequality. In the weeks that followed, the conversation around racial profiling, police abuse, and the mistreatment of Black people in predominantly white communities gained unprecedented momentum. It was clear that the events in the park, though difficult and painful for Nia, had sparked something far greater, a movement that was demanding to be heard. And Nia, though she had once been just a woman walking in the park, had now become a voice for change.